Hey guys, it's Wade. I wanted to go ahead and record this lecture for tomorrow. I know we have a group, like I said, that is out, so I wanted to go ahead and record a new lecture that is new to midterm. It replaces an old one, but this is called "The Human Organism in Health and Disease," and I think that this is kind of a really kind of a necessary lecture. So let me share my screen here, and we'll get rolling. All right, so we're talking about really just the basics of human anatomy and physiology as they apply to medical terminology, obviously, but we can't do medical terminology without uh, some level of understanding of anatomy and physiology. And I know that all of us, whether we're biomajors, whether we are biomajors, whether we're ex-phys majors, and whatever we're planning to do, right? We ultimately have to, we all have different understandings, and so it's important to kind of come together with a common understanding of anatomy and physiology as it pertains to this class, right? To learn a little bit about pathology and disease, right? So ultimately, it is really simple, and maybe this is too simple for some of you, but that's okay, right? So obviously, when we talk about anatomy, anatomy is essentially concerned with the development, structure, and organization of body parts, right, that make up the human organism, right? And so anatomy equals structure, really and truly. Anatomy describes the structure, obviously not just of biological structures, cells, tissues, so on and so forth, but also organisms of themselves, right? Whereas physiology is a study of function, right? Of those structures in question, right, that make up the human organism. So whereas we might describe, let's say, for example, we're talking about the physiology of the heart. We might describe the heart as having essentially two top chambers called ventricles, and two top chambers called atria, pardon me, and two bottom chambers called ventricles, right? And when we might describe both maybe the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves and the bicuspid and tricuspid valve, right? And so that's the anatomy. I'm describing the structure of the heart. Whereas if I wanted to talk to you about stroke volume, potentially ejection fraction, those types of things, and describe the actual function of the organ itself through propagation of obviously, um, sinus rhythm, acupotential, so on and so forth. Then we're talking about physiology or function. So anatomy equals structure, and physiology equals function. So as all of us know, if we've taken any level of biology, the structure of the human organism is obviously directly dependent upon the order below it. So you can see in our little chart here that we have on the right hand side, obviously at the very bottom level here we have organelles, right, which are essentially uh, the building blocks and the functioning units of cells, right, and that obviously cells when grouped together make up tissues, tissues when grouped together make up organs, organs when obviously grouped together make up organ systems, and then organ systems as a whole make up organisms like you and I, right? So obviously, it's really important to note, though, that in a state of health, right, that each of these components performs its proper function uh, to essentially support the level above it, right? So every single cell and every single organelle tissue in the body has both a primary and a supportive function, right? And we're not necessarily going to get into the weeds on that right now, right? But when we are functioning, um, in a state of homeostasis, in a state of health or wellness, right? All of these um, components are functioning obviously in unison, and each one contributing to the system above it for optimal function, right? So when we talk about the anatomy, guys, in particular when we talk about anatomical terms, okay, there are approximately 7,700 different anatomical terms, right, for different individual structures, and we've broken obviously those also obviously consist of obviously anatomical directions, anatomical planes, and cavities, which we're going to learn about in just a second, right? But it is always a rule of thumb, right, when discussing anatomy, to attempt to utilize the the most simple terms possible. All of us, at some point in our careers, right? All of us are gonna likely be patient facing, meaning that, right? We're going to be talking to individuals that may not have the same level of familiarity and/or language with human anatomy and physiology that we do, because we're trained. That's just the way that we were trained and educated, right? And so it is our responsibility as providers and as future healthcare providers, right, to know the anatomy well enough so that we can use the most simplistic terms in order to appropriately communicate, minimize anxiety, right, and maximize the impact uh, and the value of our conversations, right, in healthcare settings. So there have been obviously attempts to kind of try and systemize the use of anatomical terms. There is one initiative that has developed called Terminologica Anatomica. And Terminologica Anatomica is um, essentially a combined effort by some anatomists, right, to attempt to utilize common language, right, when discussing obviously the human organism, structures, so on and so forth, right. Largely, though, we have not been successful. Uh, we're seeing a bit more uniformity, but that is an additional problem that we will see as we continue through the course, is that there are multiple terms, oftentimes, that refer to the same organ. We'll see that when we talk about pulmonology, we talk about the respiratory system, and then also when we talk about the urinary system as well. So some very simple anatomical terms for all of you. I'm sure all of you know these already because you are smart people, right? And you've had exposure. Obviously, as we can see, we have our model. I'm going to stand up in my office and uh, be an active participant, but you can see our model here, right? Standing in what we know to be anatomical position, right? So palms essentially fully supinated, facing frontward, thumbs to the outside of the body, pinky essentially toward the midline, right? So that's anatomical position. Anything towards the front of the body, as you guys can see, right, is the anterior or front side of the body, right? The posterior side or the back side of the body is called the posterior side, right? So we have an anterior side and a posterior side. Um, and for those of you that maybe you're exercise physiology majors, maybe you've maybe done some FMS screening, or maybe you're looking at anatomy from more of a functional perspective. You may refer to this as potentially the anterior portions of the anterior or posterior chain, right? Not uncommon to see these little variations in anatomical language like that, uh, with the way that the anatomical terms kind of play out. So obviously, there again, medial, okay, being towards the midline. So once again, if I use the example of my hand, okay, back in anatomical position, okay, obviously my pinky is more towards the midline than my thumb. So my pinky is medial to my thumb in this case, right? Not necessarily intuitive because we don't walk around with our hands like this, right? We're a lot of times we're in neutral or kind of palm down, right? But I mean, in true anatomical position, our thumb actually is lateral, okay, to the pinky. So obviously, if medial means towards the middle or towards the midline, lateral in and of itself, okay, means away from the midline or toward the outside. Now, obviously, okay, one thing we haven't necessarily talked about yet, there are some differences here when we refer to up and down, right? So if we're talking about the trunk, for example, right, we're going to utilize within the trunk, okay, trunk and head, we're going to utilize terms essentially superior to mean essentially towards the head, right? And inferior, okay, meaning obviously, towards the tail or towards the bottom, right? So for those of you that might be applying to PA school or whatever discipline that you're applying to, if any of you plan on attending school at an osteopathic medical school and or osteopathic institution, you will also hear some different terms used. I did my doctoral work at an osteopathic medical school in Arizona. Um, and because it's an osteopathic institution, right, we also learn the terms essentially cranial, meaning toward the head, and caudad, meaning toward the tail, right? So those are also likened to superior and inferior as well. So cranial and caudad. So don't get kind of thrown off if you hear that. Now, clearly, okay, we have an exception. If we are now on the limb, right? So if we're on the arm or the leg, okay, instead of saying superior when referring to a limb, we're going to refer to proximal. Okay, so for example, my shoulder is proximal to my elbow. My shoulder's above my elbow, therefore it's proximal to my elbow. Okay. And my fingers are distal to my elbow or below my elbow. Okay. So obviously in the trunk, we use superior and inferior, and then in the extremities, proximal and distal respectively. Okay. Really important thing to also note, once again, you all have had, I'm assuming all of you have had anatomy to some degree. So this is review. Um, so as humans, we operate, we essentially, the um, human organism can be essentially split up via planes. Okay, so you see obviously the pink box there, okay, is the sagittal plane, and that divides us into medial and lateral halves, and we move essentially in an anterior posterior direction within the sagittal plane. Okay, within the coronal plane, as you can see, that's the blue, the blue rectangle or purple, whatever color that is, on the slide. Okay, that's going to divide us into essentially anterior and posterior sections, right? And we can move within that plane medially and laterally. And then obviously you can see our transverse plane here. That's going to divide us into both superior and inferior, um, halves. And we can move obviously there, not only obviously anteriorly and posteriorly, but we can also rotate around that axis. All right, let's talk about cavities, not the ones in your teeth, heaven forbid, right? Um, but the ones in your body. Okay, so we have obviously different cavities within um, human organism, right? So first and foremost, right, we have a dorsal cavity, which is on the back side. So dorsal is back, okay, dorsum, dorsal, back side, also refers to posterior side. Okay, so cranial cavity obviously is where the brain and cerebral spinal fluid is housed, as well as the spinal canal. Okay, we have our spinal cord, obviously, and cerebral spinal fluid um, in the spinal canal. Okay, but looking over at the ventral cavity, and this is obviously uh, a view from the side. So this is a lateral view of this model. Okay, we can see that we have the pleural cavity, okay, which is going to contain the lungs here. We will talk about the mediastinum in a second, which contains the heart and thymus, right? So pleural cavity, which contains the organs of the chest, specifically the lungs here, trachea, and esophagus, portions of the esophagus. We have the abdominal cavity, okay, which is going to obviously contain our abdominal organs. Uh, the diaphragm here sets kind of the top boundary of the abdominal cavity. Okay, so stomach, large small intestine, pancreas, liver, spleen, right, gallbladder, um, so on and so forth, all exist within the abdominal cavity. Obviously, we have our pelvic cavity down here. Okay, this is obviously bladder, and also obviously kidneys are also part of the abdominal cavity. Pelvic cavity includes obviously bladder um, and ureters as well, right? And portions of the colon. So we may see potentially the sigmoid colon, right? As well as part of the pelvic cavity nearing the anal opening. All right, so this is an anterior view of the same model here, okay? And we can see that we're getting a little bit more specific, right? So obviously we have, as we've seen previously, right? We have uh, our thoracic cavity, okay? We have our right and left pleural cavity where our lungs are housed, okay? We have the cardiac cavity. This is where the heart resides in the chest, okay? And then here it is, okay? Right here, this little orange cavity right above the heart. Okay, this is called the mediastinum. This is what divides the chest into left and right sides, or left and right pleural cavities, rather. Okay, and this obviously contains the heart, the esophagus, the superior portion of the esophagus, right? Um, the trachea and the thymus, right? The thymus is as we'll talk about, um, is a gland that lives right above the heart, that's large in children and actually shrinks as we get older. Um, so the mediastinum contains those organs. Okay. Okay. So that was a quick overview of anatomical terms. Here's the deal, right? This is not an anatomy class. So we're not going to spend time obviously memorizing the names of structures, right? And and reteaching you anatomy. We will touch on anatomy, obviously, to a certain extent in this class because it's necessary to teach the content, right? But, excuse me, one important point that I do want to make is that anatomy is used in different ways by different professionals, right? By different scientists, by different clinicians. Okay, the way that the vast majority of us, particularly within healthcare, are going to learn our anatomy is going to be through regional anatomy. Okay, so for example, right, if you've ever taken maybe a cadaver anatomy course, or maybe you took an advanced anatomy class. Okay, maybe you looked at maybe the organs of the chest wall, and you identified every organ inside of that area, independent of the system that it belonged to. Right. So an example. Okay, let's say we opened up the abdomen, right, and we identified all of the abdominal organs. We identified obviously stomach, large and small intestine, um, you know, liver, spleen, so on and so forth. All of those, we identified all of those organs inside of that cavity, inside of that region. Okay, that's regional anatomy. All right. Now here's the deal. We have a handful of people in this class that are going to go on to either AT school or PT school, right? So we have future athletic trainers and future physical therapists in class with us this semester, right? And we use anatomy, and all of us use anatomy in different ways, right? We can use the anatomy in any one of these three ways, but we will also spend a lot of time discussing functional anatomy. So we referenced earlier the anterior and posterior chain. Potentially, when analyzing movement, we may describe the anatomy in a functional manner, right? As one structure essentially contributes to and/or inhibits a movement pattern, right? We may utilize functional anatomy based descriptions in that capacity, right? On the other hand, okay, systemic anatomy. So, for example, okay, we have the kidneys. The kidneys exist, right, in the abdominal wall. They sit on the posterior portion of the abdominal wall, but they're not, right, a classic abdominal organ. They belong to the urinary system, right? So we can discuss our anatomy systemically as well, right? And this essentially, the anatomy when we talk about it systemically can essentially cross regions. Another example of that is let's say that we gave the example of the digestive tract earlier, looking at the anatomy of the gut, right, of the belly, stomach, large, small intestine, liver, pancreas, right, gallbladder, so on and so forth, right? Now, let's say though that you talk to maybe a gastroenterologist and or maybe even a dentist, and they said, "Look, I know that you opened up the abdominal cavity and that you've examined the anatomy regionally, but the digestive process actually starts in the mouth with the salivary glands and the teeth, right? And the breakdown of food and the secretion of salivary amylase, okay, from the salivary glands in order to break down food particles." Okay, so that, friends, is an example of systemic anatomy, okay, where we are not necessarily bound to or concerned with the specific region in which um, we are essentially kind of looking at that moment, right? We are we're utilizing the anatomy and studying it as a system, right? Okay, friends, I'm sure all of you know, have heard about this concept and know it from any biology that you've taken, probably also back in high school, right? Homeostasis. Okay, this is referred to as the steady state. Okay, all of us know about this. If you're an ex-phys major, you probably have heard this term until you're blue in the face, right? So homeostasis essentially refers to the maintenance of physiologic variables. That can mean many things. We give the example here of glucose, okay, within an acceptable range or a steady state, right? So generally speaking, okay, stress responses are typically able to restore homeostasis when a variable falls outside of the normal range. Okay, the example that we give here in this picture on the right is glucose. So let's say, for example, that it's been a long day. I've been, at class all morning. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I have not eaten. It's like I'm hungry as can be. I need some food, right? My blood glucose falls. And I'm getting hypoglycemic. So my glucose is down to probably 50 degrees or 50 degrees, 50 milligrams per deciliter. Okay. And so at that time, okay, that is a stress response. My body kicks in and utilizes a feedback loop, all right, and causes glycogen to be taken from my liver and broken down via glucagon, right? Uh, and my glucose level in my bloodstream rises or goes up, okay? Um, and the same is true, like if I'm hyperglycemic, okay, I might have just, you know, whatever, gone to a party or gone to a meal, eaten way more than I should have, right? So my glucose is pretty darn high and it's climbing fast, right? So my postprandial glucose is approaching 140. My body's like, OMG, gotta bring that down. So ultimately, the rising glucose stimulates the release of insulin from beta cells in the pancreas, right? That insulin obviously acts as a lock and key, pulls the glucose uh, into the cell, right, and utilizes it for energy, and then blood glucose drops, right, because the glucose has left the bloodstream and is now inside of the tissue cell. Okay, so there's maybe kind of a longer drawn out example, but the other way that we think about this, okay, so that stress reaction that we just talked about, that is a normal way of maintaining homeostasis, right? That is a normal response to that kind of a situation. It happens every day of our lives that we eat food or that we don't eat, right? But in the event that we become, and this is one of the problems. This is one of the problems, for example, with diabetes. This is why we see some complications with diabetes. If people have prolonged hyperglycemia in this case, okay, the body can no longer obviously produce sufficient insulin or insulin of good enough quality to regulate the blood glucose. Okay, when that happens, the only way for the body to pull the glucose, right, and or attempt to control glucose levels is via an inflammatory response, right? And when that blood glucose remains high, right, along with and initiates an inflammatory response, okay, we have these extreme deviations in these homeostatic mechanisms, right? And we have an immune response. And that is both the way that we are made to function, but right, in the event that that brings us back down to homeostasis, that's great. However, right, we ultimately also find that same very same process can be damaging. For example, if someone has prolonged inflammation. Okay, this can obviously damage the smaller diameter nerves in the fingers and toes, can cause symptoms of diabetic neuropathy. Okay, so obviously, though, the purpose of the inflammatory response is to reestablish homeostasis when normal mechanisms cannot do so. Okay, and it does that through immunity. Okay, we have obviously general immunity, right, or specific immunity, also referred to as innate immunity. Um, so an example of that is fever, in the event of a invasion of a with a pathogen. So unregulated inflammation can lead to destruction of neighboring healthy cells, i.e., in the case of neuropathy. Okay, and also denaturation of proteins. Okay, via the prolonged presence, excuse me, of inflammatory mediators. Okay, like cytokines and interleukins. So if we take a look at this picture on the left, we can see that this blue line here, okay, and with the dotted line through the middle, essentially indicates, you know, uh, essentially baseline homeostasis, right? But okay, whenever our variable of interest, whether that's insulin, okay, whether that is essentially, you know, circulating, a level of circulating cancer cells, because all of us have cancer cells in our bodies at all times. It's just that we have the ability to fend them off via our immunity, right? And that's why we don't become symptomatic, right? So obviously within that homeostatic range, we've got things well under control. But you can see that when we have those really, really sharp dips, right, either above or below, okay, that homeostatic range, um, we develop an inflammatory response, right? And so that, as we'll see in a second, this has been implicated actually in the formation of certain diseases, including cancer, and something called amyloidosis that we'll talk about. So here's the deal, okay? Inflammation, and kind of a relevant sidebar, and this is important, right? As clinicians, one of our jobs, whether it's via medication, whether it's via therapeutic agents and or exercise, our job is to mediate inflammation. Our job is to essentially use it to the benefit of the patient, but also manage it so that it doesn't become harmful to the patient, right? And in situations where obviously it can become harmful, we have seen diseases like cancer develop due to prolonged and sustained inflammatory responses that become chronic, right? So what we often see with the link between inflammation and cancer is that chronic inflammation actually results in mutations, right, of host cells. So ultimately, um, the inflammatory response kind of gets out of control and begins to essentially destroy the healthy cells surrounding it. Okay, if you're an athletic training student, we've talked about this ad nauseum, right? With our inflammatory response, we refer to that as secondary cell death, right, and/or secondary hypoxia, right? Both of those being consequences of trauma, right? However, um, in the case of cancer, right, um, ultimately we have prolonged inflammatory responses that result in the deposition of a dysplastic cell, right? Um, that cannot differentiate or does not have the ability to differentiate into a normal healthy cell, right? And so over time, due to the increased presence uh, of inflammatory cells within the area, blood flow is continually pulled into the area, okay, causing essentially the creation of new vasculature, right, to that cell, which causes the cell to continue to proliferate. Okay, and that cell continues to proliferate, excuse me, and multiply. Okay, which develops essentially into a cluster of cancer cells. One interesting characteristic of cancer cells, once they have been formed, is that they have a pretty widely disorganized extracellular matrix that immune cells generally cannot get to, right? And so uh, the immune cells are not able to obviously kind of curtail or stop the prolonged proliferation of cancer cells in this case, right? So just a little bit more about cancer here. So obviously, as we've talked about, okay, tumors are aggregations of abnormal cells, right? Generally dysplastic cells within a tissue that oftentimes look like their host, not all the time, but they're going to have characteristics of the cells that they're surrounded by. Uh, but often these can be highly irregular due to uh, the extracellular matrix that surrounds them. Okay, but just some basic definitions here for medical terminology purposes. Okay, tumors that do not spread. So there are two different types of tumors specifically that we're going to refer to. Tumors that don't spread are known as benign tumors. Okay, whereas tumors that do spread throughout the body, that have a propensity to spread throughout the body, are known as malignant tumors. Okay, so the process of a tumor spreading from its host site through the body is known as metastasis. Okay, so you may often hear it said that a cancer has metastasized or spread. So when I used to work at Trio Orthopedics, and we had a gentleman come into our clinic one time uh, with kind of a mysterious, kind of growth on his bicep. Ended up being a sarcoma, and unfortunately, due to our best efforts, that sarcoma metastasized to the gentleman's lungs, and he did pass away. And so the process of metastasis refers to um, obviously the spreading of cancer from its host to another organ, so on and so forth, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, obviously, in the coming weeks as well. Um, there's certain anatomical mechanisms that exist. Okay, another pathology that we're going to visit about just briefly is amyloidosis. Okay, amyloidosis actually can be and has been attributed to many, many diseases and actually can be fatal in some cases, right? So amyloidosis is a disease that's been linked to chronic inflammation, and it is essentially caused by the deposition of denaturated protein. Okay, protein that's been damaged. And the protein after it's been damaged is essentially deposited into tissue spaces. So from a strictly biological standpoint, amyloidosis is defined as a protein misfolding disorder. Um, but ultimately, when a protein misfolds, it cannot appropriately essentially link with other proteins, right? And so the protein actually essentially is essentially just deposited and/or makes its way into the tissue space, right? And does not become part of the cell, right? And so the other thing about denatured proteins is that they're not appropriately removed by leukocytes or other immune responses, right? They can be very difficult to actually get rid of. And so, right, those amyloid plaques or proteins can deposit themselves and start to accumulate and build up. And they may build up in the heart, okay, the brain, the liver, kidneys, or any other internal organ. So we see amyloidosis in many, many different locations in the body. Um, and so this is another process or another uh, disease that's often linked to inflammation. So here are some examples, obviously, of amyloidosis. Uh, Amyloidosis actually is essentially named, right? Excuse me, by the chain of protein that it is, whether it's light chain, excuse me, or uh, heavier chain. So you can see here on the left, this specific type of amyloid has an affinity for a specific reagent called Congo red, right? Whereas the one on the right here has kind of more of a green biorefringence. Um, this is essentially how we identify these amyloids at this point in time, right? Hopefully, though, as what we know about amyloidosis changes and grows, right, that will allow us to actually become more adept at not only diagnosing this problem, but actually identifying it. Amyloidosis is known for being extremely difficult to diagnose, and patients are often affected by substantial delays in diagnosis when they have amyloidosis. So amyloidosis, obviously, as you can see here, can cause deposits in many different areas of the body, uh, skin, right, tongue, the stroma of the mouth, right, the brain. In the case of Alzheimer's or dementia, we have discovered that there are certain tau proteins or plaques that actually accumulate within the brain. We'll talk more about that when we talk about neurology. Okay, so I like to finish all of my lectures, guys, when we talk about medical terminology with terms, right? So some root words here for you. So onco, okay, this is the root and combining valve for cancer. Okay, tomorrow you won't see this as much, but you will see it occasionally. Tomorrow, pretty easy, right? The root and combining valve for tumor. Okay, patho means pathology or disease. Maligno, okay, means bad or harmful. So there's a word. I don't remember the specific origin of the word right now, but to malign. Okay, to malign someone means to do something bad or harmful to them, right? Maybe heaven forbid speak derisively of them or something else, right? So maligno means bad or harmful. Neo, okay, neo means new. That's the root and combining vowel for new. So someone has neoplasia or a neoplasm. That is a new growth, and we have to discover, we have to look and try to figure out in these patients, is that neoplasm, is it just a simple, a simple growth? Um, is it is it malignant or is it benign, right? Hopefully, if we're lucky, right, it's benign. We can see the last one down here, this last suffix that I've given you for this lecture, oma, okay? That is a suffix that means tumor, okay? So that's oma. Now that doesn't, obviously mean malignant. Okay, it can also mean benign. So it could be a benign tumor or a malignant tumor, right? So if we have a hemangioma or a sarcoma, right, that is essentially a soft tissue tumor that can be either a connective tissue tumor, excuse me, that can be either benign or malignant, right? All right. So guys, that is the lecture. This lecture number 2. We will, for this first day of class, it's going to be a little bit lecture heavy, but that's going to allow us to get into some a little bit more fun things for class. So hope you guys are doing well. I'll see you tomorrow.